Ever get into one of those arguments where you're like totally convinced you're in the right about something? Like it's obviously the good or bad choice.
Yeah.
And the other person just sees it completely differently.
Oh, yeah. All the time.
That's what we're diving into today.
Yeah.
Moral disagreement.
It's everywhere, isn't it? I mean, really, if you think about it.
It is.
We disagree about everything. What to eat, how to live. Huge societal questions.
And it's not like this is new, right? I mean, even way back in ancient Greece, philosophers were noticing this. Sextus Empiricus, for example, he was pointing out that what's good for one person can be bad for another. It's a pretty basic observation.
It is a basic
But
observation.
it leads to some really deep questions.
Yeah, like what does it even mean when we have these disagreements? If we can't agree on the basics, like what's right and wrong, how can we even begin to have a conversation?
Yeah.
And that's what we're going to be exploring in this deep dive.
Okay.
We're going to be focusing on metaethics,
Metaethics.
which is basically the study of the nature of morality itself.
So not is this right or wrong, but what does it even mean for something to be right or wrong?
Exactly. We're looking at the foundations of morality, the underlying assumptions. And when we look at moral disagreement through this lens, it can really shake things up.
You can.
Because there are all sorts of different philosophical positions that try to make sense of it.
Right.
You've got moral realism,
No realism.
which is the idea that there are objective moral truths, whether we agree on them or not.
Right.
Then you've got the opposite end of the spectrum, nihilism,
Nihilism.
which says there are no moral truths at all. It's all just,
Made up.
made up. Yeah. And then there's relativism, which is somewhere in between,
Relativism.
that suggests moral truth depends on your perspective. So it could be your culture or your social group, maybe even just you.
So it's all relative.
Right. And then we have some even more nuanced views like constructivism, non-cognitivism, and expressivism. These offer different ways of understanding moral judgments, but they don't necessarily say those judgments are based on objective facts.
Okay, so lots of different ways of thinking about this. But it's not just theoretical, is it? I mean, we see the impact of these moral disagreements play out all the time,
Oh, absolutely.
especially in politics.
Yeah.
Think about trying to make laws, for example.
Right.
When people have fundamentally different ideas about what's right, how can we even hope to come to an agreement on something like that?
I mean, it's the classic problem of public reason. How can we justify governmental actions based on principles everyone could reasonably accept
Right.
if we can't even agree on what those principles are?
If we can't agree.
It's a fascinating area.
It is.
But for our deep dive today, we're going to stick to the metaethics. We want to see what these disagreements tell us about morality itself.
Okay, so really thinking about the big picture. What is morality? How do we know anything about it? And what are we even saying when we use words like good and bad? Those are the kinds of questions we're going to be tackling.
Yeah, and they're all interconnected. So as we explore one, it's going to inevitably lead us to the others.
All right, so let's just start with the obvious. We disagree about morality a lot.
Yeah, we do.
I mean, think about it. The death penalty, abortion, even something as simple as whether or not it's okay to eat meat. People have wildly different views on all of these things.
They do, and it's not just a modern phenomenon.
It's not.
Anthropologists and historians have shown us that moral beliefs have varied drastically across cultures throughout history.
Oh, absolutely.
There are practices like infanticide, which is the killing of infants,
Infanticide.
and geronticide,
Geronticide.
which is the killing of the elderly. These were accepted in some societies, but they're abhorrent to us.
Right. I remember reading about Napoleon Chagnon's work with the Yanomamo people.
Oh, right.
Some of their customs were definitely surprising, to say the least.
Yes, Chagnon's work has been both celebrated and criticized.
It has.
It's important to remember that we always bring our own biases to these kinds of cross-cultural comparisons.
Of course.
But regardless of the specifics of any one case, the broader point is clear. Moral beliefs vary.
They do vary.
And it's not just between cultures.
No.
Even within the same society, you have people who disagree vehemently about moral issues.
All the time.
And this is true even among experts.
It's like philosophers.
Like philosophers, exactly. You have utilitarians and Kantians who have fundamentally different ideas about what makes an action right or wrong.
Right.
You have egalitarians and libertarians who have very different conceptions of justice. And these are people who have dedicated their lives to thinking about these issues carefully and rationally,
They have.
and yet they still disagree.
So what does that tell us? I mean, what does it even mean when we have a moral disagreement? Is it like disagreeing about a scientific fact?
That's a great question, and it's one that philosophers have been grappling with for centuries. For those who hold a cognitivist view, the answer is yes.
Cognitivist.
They believe that moral judgments are essentially beliefs about moral facts. So when two people disagree about whether something is right or wrong, they're disagreeing about whether a certain moral fact is true or false, just like when you disagree about whether the earth is flat or round.
Okay, so for them it's about facts.
About facts.
But then you have the non-cognitivists.
Right, and they take a very different approach.
They do.
They argue that moral judgments are not really about beliefs or facts at all.
They're not.
No, they're more about expressions of our attitudes or emotions.
Emotions.
So when someone says something is wrong, they're not necessarily describing some objective feature of the world. They're expressing their disapproval.
Disapproval.
Or their disgust. Or maybe even just a preference. Think about it like two people arguing about what kind of ice cream is best. They're not disagreeing about some objective fact about ice cream. They just have different tastes.
Okay, so it's like one person likes chocolate and the other likes vanilla. There's no right answer.
That's the basic idea. Charles Stevenson and Simon Blackburn are two philosophers who have really explored this non-cognitivist view.
And then there's relativism, which is kind of in between those two.
Yeah, relativism is tricky. It tries to hold on to the idea that moral judgments can be true or false,
Okay.
but it says that what makes a moral judgment true is relative to something else.
Relative.
So it could be relative to your culture, your social group, or even just your individual perspective. Gilbert Harman and David Wong are two prominent relativists.
So something can be morally right in one culture and wrong in another.
That's the basic idea, yeah.
And there's no way to say which one is actually right.
Right, or at least there's no objective way to say it.
Okay, so this is like, if one culture says it's okay to eat meat and another says it's not, they could both be right according to their own moral framework.
Right.
But that sounds a little strange, doesn't it? I mean, it seems like there should be some way to say who's actually right.
There are definitely some challenges with relativism. One simple version is called subjectivism. Subjectivism. And it says that when you say something is right or wrong, you're just stating your own personal opinion.
Okay, so meat is wrong just means I don't like meat.
Basically, yeah. But the problem with this, as G.E. Moore pointed out, is that it makes genuine moral disagreement impossible. If everyone is just stating their own preferences, then there's nothing to disagree about.
It's like two ships passing in the night.
Right. They're not actually engaging with each other. So other relativist views try to get around this problem.
How do they do that?
Well, some argue that moral truth is relative to shared standards within a particular group or culture. So if you and I are both part of a community that values honesty, then we can have a genuine disagreement about whether a certain action is honest or not.
Okay, so it's not just about my personal opinion, it's about whether something fits within the rules of our community.
Exactly. But this still leaves the problem of disagreements between different communities with different standards.
Right, because if one community says honesty is always the best policy, and another says sometimes lying is necessary, how can you compare those two?
Well, some relativists might say you can't. They might embrace a form of non-cognitivism.
Non-cognitivism.
And argue that even these shared standards are ultimately based on underlying attitudes or emotions. So even if two statements are both true relative to their own standards, they could still be expressing conflicting desires or values.
So it's like they're playing different games with different rules.
Kind of, yeah.
Even if they're using the same words.
And then there are even more complex relativist views, like faultless disagreement.
Faultless disagreement.
Yeah, where the content of a moral judgment is actually the same for everyone, but its truth value depends on the standards of the person who's making the judgment.
That's a mouthful.
It is. But the basic idea is that two people could both be thinking about the same concept, like stealing is wrong, but one person, using their own standards, could judge it to be true, while the other, using their standards, could judge it to be false.
So it's true for one person and false for another.
Exactly. And neither of them is necessarily wrong. They're just applying different standards.
Okay, so lots of different ways to think about what moral disagreement actually is. But even with all this philosophical complexity, we can usually recognize a moral disagreement when we see one.
Right, absolutely.
I mean, we all have those moments where we're just like, no, you're wrong.
We do, and we see how these disagreements play out. The arguments, the clashing desires, the different ways of seeing the world.
We do. Now, you mentioned that some disagreements are more significant for understanding morality itself than others.
Yeah,
You called them radical moral disagreements.
I did.
What makes these special?
Well, the idea is that these are disagreements that wouldn't go away even if everyone had all the facts, were perfectly rational, and had really thought things through carefully.
So it's not just about a lack of information or a misunderstanding.
No, it's deeper than that.
It's like even under ideal conditions, people would still disagree.
Exactly. And this is often contrasted with disagreements in science,
Science.
where we tend to think that disagreements are ultimately resolvable.
Right, because more evidence, more research will eventually lead to the truth.
Yeah.
But in morality, some philosophers think that there might just be fundamental disagreements that can't be resolved that way.
And the fact that even philosophers themselves often disagree about really basic moral principles is seen as evidence for this.
So even the experts can't agree.
Even the experts. Now, this is obviously a problem for moral realists,
It is.
because if there are objective moral truths, you would expect that people would be able to converge on them, at least under ideal conditions.
Right, if there's one truth out there, we should all be able to see it eventually.
So realists have come up with various ways of trying to downplay or explain away these seemingly radical moral disagreements.
How do they do that?
Well, one strategy is to argue that some disagreements are merely apparent. That is, they might look like disagreements on the surface, but if you dig a little deeper, you find that people are actually talking about different things or using different background assumptions.
So like a misunderstanding.
In a way, yeah. Mackey himself acknowledged this possibility, though he didn't think it applied to most cases of moral disagreement.
What's an example of this?
Take polygamy.
Polygamy.
In some cultures, it's accepted, in others, it's condemned. But a realist might say that these judgments are really about different things. Maybe in one culture, polygamy is seen as a way of providing for widows and orphans, while in another, it's seen as a threat to social stability.
Okay, so they're using the same word, but they're thinking about it in completely different contexts.
Exactly. Another common realist strategy is to argue that many moral disagreements are due to factors that are similar to those that cause disagreements in science.
Similar to science.
So things like lack of information, biases, or even just self-interest clouding our judgment.
So it's not that there's no truth, it's just that we're not good at seeing it yet.
Right, and Derek Parfit makes an interesting point about this.
Yeah.
He argues that secular moral reasoning is actually a relatively new development compared to scientific inquiry,
New development.
and that in the past, things like religious dogma might have interfered with our ability to think clearly about morality, just like it interfered with science before the scientific revolution.
So we're still catching up.
Yeah, he's suggesting that we might see more agreement on moral issues in the future as our moral reasoning matures.
That's an optimistic view.
It is. And some realists also point to the fact that we do see convergence on some moral issues as evidence that there are objective truths we're gradually discovering.
Convergence.
But of course, this raises the question of how to explain the areas where there's still widespread disagreement.
Right, because if convergence is evidence for objective truth, then doesn't divergence suggest the opposite?
It's a good point.
Now, we've been talking a lot about philosophy, but what about the actual research that's been done on moral disagreement? I mean, anthropologists, psychologists, they've documented this phenomenon in the real world.
They have.
So why don't we see more engagement with this empirical research in these philosophical debates?
That's a good question, and it's something that some philosophers have been calling for more of.
They have.
There are a few reasons for this gap.
Okay.
One is that philosophers are often more interested in the theoretical implications of disagreement.
Theoretical implications.
So they're less concerned with simply documenting that it exists,
Yeah.
and more interested in what it tells us about the nature of morality itself.
So the what-if question.
Exactly.
Like, what if there really is radical moral disagreement? What would that mean for our understanding of morality?
Right. And another reason is that a lot of the empirical research that's been done hasn't been designed to address the specific questions that philosophers are asking.
Right, because scientists and philosophers have different goals.
They do.
So they might be looking at the same phenomenon, but from different angles.
Exactly. But this doesn't mean that the research is irrelevant.
It doesn't.
It just means that we need to be careful about how we interpret it.
Careful interpretation.
And it also suggests that there is a need for more collaboration between philosophers and empirical researchers,
Collaboration.
so that we can design studies that can actually speak to these philosophical questions.
That would be interesting. So have there been any attempts to bridge this gap?
There have been some. One early example is Richard Brandt's study of the Hopi people.
The Hopi people.
He argued that he found differences in moral attitudes between the Hopi and white Americans that couldn't be explained just by differences in their factual beliefs.
So a genuine moral difference.
Yeah. Though, as you might expect, this study has been subject to criticism.
Of course.
More recently, you have work by Jonathan Haidt,
Jonathan Haidt.
who's done a lot of research on the psychology of morality.
Psychology of morality.
And his findings suggest that there are deep-seated differences in moral intuitions between people with different political ideologies.
Interesting.
And then there's the famous study by Doris, Plakias, and Stish on the culture of honor in the American South.
Right. I remember reading about that.
They used research by Cohen and Nisbet, who found that white men in the South are more likely to respond aggressively to insults than men in the North.
More aggressively.
Yeah. And they attributed this to a culture of honor that's rooted in the South's history of herding economies,
Herding economies.
where your reputation for toughness was essential for protecting your livestock.
Makes sense.
So Doris, Plakias, and Stinch argued that this difference in attitudes towards violence and honor could be an example of a genuinely radical moral disagreement.
Okay, so it's not just about different factual beliefs. It's about a fundamental difference in moral values.
That's their argument. Though it's important to note that there are alternative explanations.
There are.
Some philosophers, like David Brink, might argue that it's more about a lack of sufficient reflection.
Lack of reflection.
That maybe these men in the South haven't really thought through the implications of their beliefs about honor.
So they might change their minds if they thought about it more carefully.
Possibly, yeah. So the question of whether this is a truly radical moral disagreement is still open for debate.
It is.
And this highlights a broader point.
Which is?
Which is that the debate about radical moral disagreement often hinges on what we consider to be a flaw in moral reasoning.
A flaw.
Like, what does it mean to be sufficiently rational or reflective?
Right.
These are themselves philosophical questions.
They are.
And until we have a better understanding of them, it's going to be difficult to say for sure whether any particular moral disagreement is truly radical or not.
It will be. Okay, so we've explored the nature and existence of moral disagreement and looked at some empirical research. Now let's dig into the philosophical arguments that are based on this phenomenon.
Yeah, let's do that.
You mentioned metaphysical arguments from moral disagreement.
I did.
What are these arguments trying to tell us?
These arguments use the fact of moral disagreement to try to draw conclusions about the fundamental nature of morality.
Okay, so they're using disagreement to make a point about what morality really is.
Exactly. One of the most famous examples of this is John Mackey's argument from relativity.
The argument from relativity.
Mackey used this argument to support his view that there are no objective moral facts at all.
No objective moral facts.
Right, which is known as moral nihilism or error theory.
Error theory.
Now, Mackey's argument is often interpreted as an inference to the best explanation.
Inference to the best explanation.
The idea is that the best explanation for the widespread and persistent disagreement we see in morality is that there's simply nothing objective to disagree about.
Nothing objective.
But as with a lot of philosophy, the interpretation of Mackey's argument is itself a matter of debate.
Of course it is.
So let's take a closer look at what Mackey actually said. He starts by pointing out, as we've discussed, that there's a huge amount of variation in moral codes across cultures and throughout history.
There is.
He then notes that this kind of variation doesn't automatically lead us to conclude that there are no objective facts in other areas, like science.
Right, we don't say that gravity doesn't exist just because physicists disagreed about it for a while.
Exactly. So Mackey needs to explain why morality is different. And he argues that the best explanation for the variation in moral codes is that they reflect different ways of life, rather than being attempts to grasp objective moral truths.
Ways of life.
So, for example, he suggests that monogamy is approved of in societies where it's the norm because people are used to it, not because it's objectively morally good.
So morality is more about custom than truth.
That's what Mackey is suggesting. But here's where the inference to the best explanation interpretation gets a bit tricky.
Tricky.
Because Mackey's ways of life explanation doesn't actually rule out the possibility of objective moral truths.
It doesn't.
No. You could imagine a world where there are objective moral truths, but where different societies, for various reasons, develop different ways of life that don't perfectly align with those truths.
Okay, so they could be missing the mark.
Exactly. So it's not clear that the fact that Mackey's explanation is a good one actually proves that there are no objective moral
It
facts.
just proves that there's another way to explain the disagreement.
Right. So instead of saying that Mackey's argument shows that the best explanation entails there are no moral facts, it might be more accurate to say that it shows that the best explanation doesn't require moral facts,
Doesn't require moral facts.
which weakens the case for moral realism, but it doesn't definitively refute it.
It doesn't.
However, Mackey's argument does open up the possibility of developing a more comprehensive anti-realist theory.
Anti-realist theory.
One that could explain not only the differences in moral beliefs, but also any similarities that we might observe.
Similarities.
Right, because if we find that there's convergence on some moral issues, a good anti-realist theory would need to be able to account for that too.
It would.
And this kind of theory might be more appealing than a realist theory that has to do a lot of work to explain away the persistent disagreements.
Interesting. You also mentioned disagreement and inaccessibility as another metaphysical argument against realism.
Right. This argument takes a slightly different approach.
How so?
Well, it starts with the idea that if there were objective moral truths, and if those truths were accessible to us, then we should expect to see more agreement on moral issues than we actually do.
Okay, so the disagreement itself is evidence against the existence of objective moral truths.
Or at least evidence against their accessibility.
Accessibility.
Right, because if they were really out there and if we were capable of knowing them, wouldn't we have figured them out by now?
Maybe, though it seems like we're always arguing about morality.
We are. And that's the problem for realists.
It is.
They have to either explain away the disagreement or come up with some reason why we shouldn't expect agreement, even if moral truths exist.
How do they do that?
Well, some might argue that moral truths are just really hard to know.
Really hard to know.
That maybe they're so complex and nuanced that it's almost inevitable that we'll disagree about them.
So it's not that they don't exist, it's just that they're beyond our grasp.
Right. But of course, this raises the question of why we should believe in them in the first place if we can't know anything about them.
Good questions.
Other realists might concede that some moral issues are genuinely indeterminate,
Indeterminate.
meaning there's no objectively right answer.
Okay.
This could explain why we see so much disagreement on those issues.
Because there's no fact of the matter to discover.
Right.
But then the question becomes, which issues are indeterminate?
Exactly.
And how do we know?
And do the areas where realists are willing to concede indeterminacy actually line up with the areas where we see the most disagreement?
Right, because you would expect that if an issue is truly indeterminate, people would be more willing to acknowledge that and maybe not fight so hard about
It's
it.
one way to think about it, yeah. So these arguments from disagreement and inaccessibility pose a real challenge to moral realism.
They do. They force realists to come up with some pretty creative ways of reconciling their view with the reality of moral disagreement.
They do.
Okay, so we've seen how moral disagreement can be used to challenge the very idea that there are objective moral truths.
Right.
But it also raises questions about how we could possibly know anything about morality, even if those truths do exist.
Right.
This brings us to the epistemological arguments from moral disagreement.
Right.
What are these arguments all about?
These arguments focus on the implications of moral disagreement for our moral knowledge.
Moral knowledge.
So even if we grant that there are moral facts, can we ever be justified in believing any particular moral claim?
Justified in believing,
Right, given how much disagreement there is.
given the disagreement.
Exactly. And the skeptical conclusions that these arguments aim for can vary in strength. Some argue for a very strong form of skepticism,
Strong skepticism.
saying that moral knowledge is completely impossible.
Impossible.
But others take a more moderate approach,
Moderate.
suggesting that we might just lack moral knowledge in our current situation, but that doesn't mean it's impossible in principle.
Okay, so maybe we're just not there yet.
Right. But even this more moderate form of skepticism can be problematic for moral realism.
How so?
Well, if it turns out that we're not justified in believing any of our current moral beliefs, then that raises serious doubts about whether we have any good reason to believe in moral facts in the first place.
It does. It's like saying, even if there's a right answer, how can you possibly know what it is?
Exactly. Now, these arguments about moral knowledge often raise deeper issues about the nature of knowledge and justification in general.
The nature of knowledge.
Some philosophers who make these arguments don't necessarily endorse any particular theory of knowledge. They just think that their skeptical conclusions follow from pretty much any plausible account.
So it doesn't matter what your theory of knowledge is, you're still going to end up skeptical.
That's the idea. but others do explicitly state their epistemological framework.
Okay.
And one area where this debate plays out is in the context of peer disagreement.
Fear disagreement.
The basic idea is that if someone who is just as smart and well-informed as you disagrees with you about something, then that should undermine your confidence in your own belief.
It should.
And this is especially relevant to morality, where we see so much disagreement among seemingly intelligent and well-intentioned people.
It is.
Sarah McGrath has developed a powerful argument along these lines.
Sarah McGrath.
She argues that if someone who's equally rational as you denies one of your beliefs, then your belief doesn't amount to knowledge.
It doesn't amount to knowledge.
And she applies this principle to moral beliefs.
Moral beliefs.
So if I believe that abortion is wrong, but someone who I consider to be my epistemic peer believes that it's permissible, then McGrath would say that I don't actually know that abortion is wrong.
So my belief isn't justified.
Exactly. And this connects to a broader view in epistemology called conciliationism,
Conciliationism.
which basically says that you should reduce your confidence in your beliefs when you find yourself disagreeing with your peers.
Okay.
Now, conciliationism itself is a controversial view.
It is.
There are arguments for steadfastness, which says that sometimes you have good reasons to stick to your guns even when others disagree.
Steadfastness.
And there are also worries about self-defeat.
Self-defeat.
Because if conciliationism is true and someone disagrees with you about it, shouldn't you then reduce your confidence in conciliationism itself?
It sounds like a paradox.
It can be, yeah. But in the context of moral disagreement, conciliationism offers a way to derive skeptical conclusions without having to rely on hypothetical scenarios or ideal conditions. Because even in the real world, we often find ourselves disagreeing with people who we consider to be our peers.
We do.
But it's important to note that the skepticism you get from conciliationism is limited in scope.
Limited in scope.
It only undermines our current justification for our beliefs.
Current justification.
It doesn't rule out the possibility that we could gain moral knowledge in the future.
So there's still hope.
There's still hope.
Now, you also mentioned disagreement and safety as another epistemological argument.
Yes, this argument focuses on the idea that disagreement might be a sign of unreliable belief-forming processes.
Unreliable belief-forming processes.
The thought is that if lots of people are forming different beliefs about the same thing, then maybe the way they're forming those beliefs isn't very reliable.
Okay.
And if that's the case, then our own moral beliefs might be unsafe.
Unsafe.
Meaning that we could easily have been wrong in forming them.
Easily been wrong.
Now, this argument relies on a principle in epistemology called the safety condition for knowledge,
Safety condition.
which basically says that for a belief to count as knowledge, it has to be true, and you have to be justified in believing it. But it also has to be the case that you couldn't have easily been wrong in forming that belief.
Okay.
So if I look out the window and see a tree, and I form the belief that there's a tree outside, that belief is safe if it's true that there's a tree outside, and if I couldn't have easily been mistaken about that, given the way I formed the belief.
Right, because maybe I'm hallucinating or something.
Exactly.
But in the case of morality, if there's widespread disagreement, that suggests that maybe our belief-forming processes aren't very reliable.
And that our beliefs might therefore be unsafe.
Unsafe.
Now, this argument is not without its challenges.
What are the challenges?
Well, it can be difficult to say exactly what counts as a method of forming moral beliefs.
A method.
And it's also not always clear what easily means in this context.
Okay, so there's some vague